Have you ever stopped to think what it would be like to wake up every day without an alarm clock, without a cell phone, but to the shrill sound of an iron whistle that couldn't be ignored? Well, that's how the life of a worker in 19th century England, a life long in hours, but short in possibilities. It seems strange to imagine, but everything we now call basic rights simply didn't exist. And the most curious or disturbing thing is that the Industrial Revolution, so celebrated in books, had a dark side that almost no one likes to talk about. While machines gleamed and cities grew, men, women, and even children were transformed into replaceable parts, living in conditions that would make any of us give up on day one. After all, does progress have a smell? Does it make a sound? Does it have a human cost? Now, tell me, have you ever imagined yourself in that scenario? Waking up before the sun, breathing coal, eating stale bread, and repeating the same movement thousands of times. Maybe today you complain about the traffic or the computer screen, but what if you had to trade that for the exhausting routine of a Victorian factory? It doesn't seem so bad to have to answer a few emails, does it? Brace yourself, because the story you're about to hear isn't epic. It's not grand. It's not heroic. It's boring, slow, repetitive. But that's precisely why it will captivate you. Because sometimes the most surprising part of the story lies in the most ordinary details. And perhaps, in the end, you'll realize that modern life still harbors echoes of that gray routine. By the way, before we begin, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is now. It'll be interesting to imagine together how your current routine intersects with theirs, even though we're separated by more than a century. The curious thing is to realize how before all this began, life in the countryside seemed stable, albeit harsh. People woke with the rooster's crow, cultivated the land, tended the animals, and returned home when the sun set. It was a repetitive but predictable routine, almost like a natural clock. Suddenly, the Industrial Revolution arrived, and that clock was replaced by the factory whistle. Imagine the chaos, a lifetime guided by nature, replaced by gears and smoke. The peasants, many of them without much wealth, saw the industrial cities as a promise of opportunity. Their hope was simple: trade the hoe for the machine, believing the work would be easier. Little did they know, they were about to face long days, stifling heat, and incessant noise. Imagine yourself leaving the countryside today to try your luck in Sao Paulo. The move seems full of possibilities, but it exacts a high price. Mass migration created cities that swelled faster than they could support. Cramped houses, narrow streets, and a constant smell of smoke hung in the air. There was no urban planning to accommodate so many people at once. Many slept in shared rooms, sharing space with strangers, akin to sharing a hostel room, only without the charm or choice. It was pure survival, and every inch of ground seemed worth its weight in gold. At the same time, there was a fascination surrounding machines. They were seen almost as magical creatures that transformed cotton into fabric at a speed never before imagined. For a farmer accustomed to planting and waiting months for the harvest, seeing a machine produce in minutes was almost unbelievable. But this admiration soon gave way to exhaustion. The noise, the rhythm, and the mechanical demands took away any romanticism that might have existed. If we think about it, this scenario is not so far from our reality. Today, we trade fresh air for closed offices, where we spend hours staring at a screen. The difference is that instead of the factory whistle, It's the cell phone notification that sets the pace. Both hold, both demand, It's as if the Industrial Revolution had simply changed its clothes, but maintained the same controlling character. And so, from a natural awakening in the countryside to the artificial awakening of the city, people were thrust into a new world, a world that seemed to promise more, but delivered less. This transition wasn't just physical, it was also emotional, and it's at this point that the true story of the worker's routine begins, marked by relentless schedules and unwelcoming environments, which leads us to reflect on how the simple act of waking up was no longer the same. The first cotton mills rose like veritable monsters of brick and iron, dominating the urban landscape. For those coming from the countryside, the sight of these gigantic constructions was almost intimidating. The noise of the water wheels and gears could be heard hundreds of meters away. It was as if the city had a metallic heart that beat restlessly, imposing its rhythm on everyone. Life around these mills revolved like a satellite orbiting a planet. Inside, the scene was both fascinating and frightening. Endless rows of looms, chains, pulleys, and wheels moved endlessly. Workers walked among them like ants in an anthill, each performing their own repetitive task. The smell of cotton in the air, mixed with the stifling heat, created a heavy atmosphere. It was impossible not to feel the oppression of the environment. Even the silence, when it occurred, sounded strange, as if something were wrong. Many accounts from the time described these factories as veritable schools of strict discipline. There was no room for delays, mistakes, or distractions. One slip up could cost you your job or even get your finger caught in the gears. Think about it. Today, you lose concentration at work and get a scolding from your boss. Back then, a moment of distraction could mean an irreversible accident. The margin for error was minimal, almost, and yet there was a kind of pride in working in these places. For some, being employed in a cotton mill represented status. After all, that was where progress was happening. It was like working at a tech startup today, exhausting, intense, but full of prestige. The difference was that instead of laptops, there were giant looms. Instead of gourmet coffee, just a cold lunchbox in your pocket. This environment shaped not only the body, but also the mind. Workers began to see their lives as a machine, repetitive and calculated. Time was no longer marked by sunrise and sunset, but by the rhythm of machines. And this subtle change was brutal because it altered one's self-perception. You were no longer a person tending the land, but a cog in the production process. The human being became one with the machine they operated. Thus, cotton mills and weaving mills became symbols of the new world, a world that glittered with promises of wealth but hid a routine of sweat, noise, and fatigue. And as these spaces grew in number and importance, the stories of those who lived within them began to reveal a detail that at first glance few noticed. The metallic sound did not stop, even when the worker went to rest. The worker's day began even before the sun rose. Still in the early hours of the morning, when the cold bit the skin and the streets were plunged into darkness, the factory whistle pierced the silence. It was a high-pitched metallic sound that seemed to pierce through walls and dreams. Imagine waking not to a gentle alarm clock, but to an iron scream that accepted no excuses. This was the daily call to toil, inescapable as breathing itself. Waking up in those days didn't bring the calm of a hot cup of coffee in the kitchen or a refreshing bath. It was hurried, almost desperate. The clothes were already laid out beside the bed, because every minute counted. Being late could mean a pay cut, or even the loss of one's job. There was no time for laziness. The body, still tired from the previous day, needed to obey immediately, as if it were just another cog in a machine that would soon be turning again. Some describe this routine as living in a prison without bars. Think about how we complain today when our cell phone rings too early for work. Now imagine a call that can't be snoozed or disconnected. There was no snooze button on the factory whistle. It was either get up or get up. And while today a strong coffee would get us through the morning, back then the only energy often came from a hastily swallowed piece of stale bread. The whistle also had a curious effect on the community. It woke not just one person, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of people at once. It was as if the entire city was breathing to the same rhythm. Have you ever heard a church bell echoing through an entire neighborhood? Multiply that feeling tenfold, but replace the enchantment with the weight of obligation. The sound was collective, and so was the exhaustion. No one escaped, and there was something symbolic about this forced awakening. The worker wasn't waking up for himself, but for the factory. His time no longer belonged to him, it was borrowed. It's similar to when we feel like we live to respond to emails and deadlines, not for our own dreams. The difference is that in the 19th century, this feeling was even more literal. Even the time to open one's eyes was dictated by the boss's logic. Thus the dawn began without a sun, but with a sound that reminded everyone that life had an invisible owner. And if waking up was like this, imagine what the journey to the factory would be like, through narrow, poorly lit, and always smoky streets, where each step already announced a full day of effort. The journey to the factory was almost always made on foot. Narrow streets, uneven pavement, and puddles of water mixed with mud and coal marked the landscape. The smell of smoke from the chimneys permeated the air early in the morning, tainting your clothes and hair. Imagine leaving home every day, and before you even started work, already covered in a layer of soot. The journey wasn't just a commute, it was the first endurance test of the day. The walk had a heavy pace, unhurried and joyless. Workers of different ages walked side by side, but silence prevailed. The only constant sound was the slap of shoes against the wet stones, accompanied by the distant factory whistle that reminded them, "You must arrive." It was as if each step were marked by a countdown where delay could be costly. Even the path bore the weight of discipline. There were no modern distractions like music on headphones or podcasts. What was left was a mind filled with worries. Would the paycheck arrive in full? Would there be enough food for the week? And if the machine broke down, who would be held responsible? Today, when we walk to work, we might even complain about the traffic or the crowded bus. But back then, discomfort wasn't a detail. It was the norm, daily and inevitable. Some commutes were even more brutal. Workers lived miles away, facing intense cold, rain, or snow. Without proper clothing, their bodies suffered before the workday even began. It's like running a marathon and already exhausted. Think about it. The effort didn't begin at the factory. It began at the front door. Every dark street was a reminder that life was full of obstacles even before the clock struck the start of the shift. And there was, in the midst of all this, a kind of collective acceptance. No one expected comfort. The soot clinging to skin and the smell of coal were normal, almost invisible to those who lived there. What would be unbearable for us today was just part of the landscape for them. It's curious to think how humans adapt, even to discomfort. What seemed impossible yesterday can become routine today. So, step by step, the weary mass of workers reached the factory gate, as if the journey were a preview of what was to come. And upon crossing that gate, what awaited them was a world of noisy machines, demanding attention and seemingly endless energy. Inside the factory, the worker's life was reduced to the metallic sound of gears. The spinning and weaving machines spun restlessly, as if never tiring, and demanded the same constancy from the men and women who operated them. The routine was repetitive to the point of becoming hypnotic. Pulling, adjusting, cutting, repeat. It was like being trapped in an endless cycle where each gesture seemed identical to the last. The thing is, despite seeming simple, the work required extreme attention. A misplaced thread, the slightest distraction, and the fabric would be lost, resulting in scolding, pay cuts, or even dismissal. Imagine spending hours in front of a spreadsheet today, correcting line by line, with no room for error. Now multiply that pressure by the physical risk of having your hand swallowed by the machine. It was a constant dance between precision and danger. This repetition shaped the worker's mind, which began to confuse its own movements with the rhythm of the machine. It's as if the body already knew what to do before the thought even occurred. And at the end of the day, many still felt the echo of the gears in their ears, like an endless hum. Have you ever left a concert with the music stuck in your head? It was the same feeling, only without the music. Just the curious thing is that amid this monotony, there was also a certain comfort, predictability. The worker knew exactly what to expect and didn't need to think beyond the task at hand. Today, when someone repeats a gym workout or a meditation practice, they seek that same cadence to switch off their mind. The difference is that for the worker, there was no choice, no rest. It was routine turned into obligation. And yet, human beings always find loopholes. Some workers invented small strategies to endure the hours, humming softly, chatting discreetly, or creating mind games like counting how many times the machine completed a cycle. These seemingly banal details were sparks of humanity amidst the gray gears. They were reminders that despite living as cogs, they were still people. Thus, day after day, life inside the factory became an endless repetition, where even time seemed sewn from the same fabric, and while the mind tried to distract itself, the body wore itself out from the deafening noise and suffocating monotony, paving the way for an environment where the sound of the machines spoke louder than any human voice. The factory sound wasn't just a background detail, it was the invisible protagonist of working class life. Gears grinding, belts sliding, hammers spinning, all at once, without pause. It was like being in a thunderclap that never ended. The ears wouldn't rest, the brain wouldn't shut off. For many, the noise became so natural that even at home, in the silence of the night, they could still hear the metallic echo. This incessant noise not only tired people, but also made them sick. It caused headaches, irritation, difficulty sleeping, and in many cases, premature deafness. Today, we use noise-canceling headphones to escape the urban chaos. Back then, there was no escape. Noise was the soundtrack of the industrial 19th century. It was like living inside an orchestra, except without a conductor, without music, just audible chaos. And yet, some people got used to it. Humans have an uncanny ability to adapt to discomfort. After a few weeks, the noise seemed to disappear, not because it diminished, but because the body gave up fighting it. It's like when you move near a busy avenue. At first, every horn honks. After months, you barely notice the traffic. But in the case of the worker, the price of this adaptation was his hearing health. Some workers tried to drown out the noise with little tricks, wrapping cloths around their ears, trying to stand close to walls that would muffle the noise a bit, or communicating through gestures, since speaking was nearly useless. Imagine trying to talk to someone at a heavy rock concert, but for 12 hours straight, every day foul. That was the routine. The human voice lost ground to the metallic voice of the machines. The curious thing is that this environment even shaped the way people thought. The constant noise prevented deep reflection. The mind worked in short, rapid bursts, as if constantly racing to keep up with the external rhythm. There was no silence for dreaming, imagining, or simply listening to oneself. The noise was more than physical, it was psychological, shaping behavior. And when the day ended, the worker would leave the factory with his ears still ringing, as if the sound were a shadow clinging to him. This auditory fatigue compounded the physical strain, creating an exhaustion that wouldn't go away even with rest. And it was precisely in this state that the worker would face the next hurdle in his routine, the scarcity of breaks to recuperate his body and mind. The routine inside the factory didn't allow for generous breaks. Time seemed to be measured solely in production. The more parts, the more profit. The more downtime, the more losses. Workers worked for hours on end, with breaks so short they barely had time to breathe. It was as if the very idea of rest was seen as laziness. Imagine spending the entire day chasing something, never being able to sit down and just exist. The body, of course, took its toll. Heavy legs, aching arms, tired eyes from so much repetitive strain. Today, if you stay a few hours without getting up from your computer, you'll feel back pain. Now imagine 12 or 16 hours straight, standing, operating heavy machinery, without a chair, without a break. Rest wasn't just scarce, it was practically non existent. And the curious thing is that even eating happened at the same hurried pace. An improvised meal, often eaten standing up, with simple food, a piece of bread, cold potatoes, porridge. No long lunches or coffee breaks like we have today. Snacking was more like fueling a machine than nourishing a person. The body received no pleasure, just basic fuel to keep running. This lack of pause also affected the mind. Without time to reflect, talk, or rest our senses, life was reduced to the act of work. It's as if each worker were swallowed up by the factory's logic. Today we have breaks to stretch, chat with colleagues, and have coffee. Back then, all of this would have been an unthinkable luxury. Rest, when it existed, was more a concession from the machine than a human right. But still, human beings found ways to reclaim their humanity. Some used precious seconds to take a deep breath, close their eyes, or exchange a quick joke with a colleague next to them. These moments, however brief, served as small breaths of life amidst the suffocation, small acts of resistance against a system that viewed every minute as either profit or loss. And so, the workdays went on interminably, with workers barely remembering what it was like to sit down without rushing. The lack of rest wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Precisely because of this absence, the hours became even longer, dragged out, paving the way for the next point, the brutality of workdays that reached 16 hours a day. The clock inside the factory seemed to have its own rhythm, slower, heavier, as if mocking human fatigue. 12, sometimes 16, hours of work dragged by with painful slowness. For the worker, each minute seemed multiplied by 10, It's like waiting in an endless line, only instead of waiting, they had to repeat tiresome movements without respite. Time became an enemy. These long hours left no room for life outside the factory. Workers would leave home in the dark and return in the dark, as if the sun had ceased to exist. Life was reduced to the commute and the work, with no room for leisure, learning, or simple socializing. Today we complain about 8-hour days, but back then, double that workload was the rule, not the exception. And even then, the pay barely covered basic expenses. The body, of course, reacted. Profound exhaustion, aching muscles, red eyes. Many fell asleep standing up, leaning against the machines, and woke to scoldings or fines. Imagine the scene: a man fighting sleep, blinking heavily, but forced to keep up with the never ending machine. It's similar to driving for hours without a break, but there was no shoulder to pull over, on no option to stop. This routine also destroyed family ties. Parents barely saw their children, siblings barely spoke to each other. The house ceased to be a home and became merely a place to rest briefly between one journey and the next. It's like living in a cheap hotel where you only go to sleep and leave again. Home lost its emotional function, becoming merely a place of survival. And there was also a profound psychological effect. Working so many hours made workers believe their lives had no purpose other than production. A person's worth came to be measured by how long they could stand, repeating gestures. This cruel logic shaped entire identities, erasing dreams and desires. After all, how could one dream if there wasn't even time for adequate sleep? Thus, the endless hours piled up like heavy bricks on the worker's shoulders. And amid this oppression of time, another equally suffocating element emerged: the rigid discipline and constant vigilance of the supervisors, who allowed neither lapses nor respites. Inside the factory, the figure of the supervisor was almost as feared as the noise of the machines themselves. He walked the halls with a watchful eye, ready to catch any slip up. It wasn't just about working, but working under constant observation. It was like living in a classroom where the teacher never takes his eyes off you. The atmosphere was perpetually tense, and even an untimely gesture could be punished. Discipline was severely imposed. Tamed shifts, standardized movements, mandatory silence. If the feeling of being monitored by cameras at work already bothers us today, imagine the physical presence of someone noting every small mistake. Workers were not evaluated for their creativity or initiative, but for their ability to obey without question. It was obedience, not skill, that ensured survival. Many reports tell of how even quick conversations between colleagues were reprimanded. An untimely word could be construed as a distraction. It was as if the factory had only one voice, the sound of the machines. Humans had to be silent so that production could speak. This constant surveillance shaped submissive personalities who learned to avoid any gesture that might attract attention. Silence in this environment was synonymous with safety. Interestingly, this rigid discipline also produced a psychological effect that resonates to this day. People who grew up under this system maintained, even outside the factory, an attitude of automatic obedience. It's like someone leaving the army and maintaining military habits in their daily lives, making their beds with precision, marching almost without realizing it. In the case of the worker, their body and mind were always ready to obey orders, even away from the machine. There was, of course, a constant fear behind this submission, the fear of losing one's job. With so many people migrating to the cities, The labor supply was enormous. One slip up was all it took for someone desperate for work to replace them. This meant that each worker had to accept humiliations in silence, because complaining meant risking what little they had. It was a discipline sustained by fear, not motivation. Thus, the factory became a space where freedom seemed non existent. Surveillance and strictness turned every minute into a test of patience and endurance. And if the discipline was harsh, even worse were the fines for delays or mistakes, which relentlessly punished even the most diligent. Victorian factories were not content simply to extract maximum labor. They also punished every slip up with severe fines. Arriving a few minutes late was grounds for a pay cut. A thread error, a piece of wasted fabric, everything was charged as if it were a personal debt. Imagine working for weeks and seeing your pay shrink because of inevitable mistakes. It was a system that turned necessity into silent blackmail. These fines were calculated in an almost cruel manner. The amount seemed small to the factory owner, but for the worker, it meant less food on the table, less coal to heat the house, less chance of surviving the winter. It was as if every mistake had a price in potatoes or bread, and the worker, already exhausted, still carried the constant anguish of making a mistake and losing part of the little he earned. The curious thing is that these punishments weren't intended to correct, but to intimidate. Instead of teaching workers to avoid mistakes, the logic was to make them work under constant fear. Today, when a company imposes abusive targets, we feel the psychological weight of it. Now imagine living in a system where punishment came directly to the pocket, with no dialogue, no second chances. Fear was the main manager. Many accounts from the time show that even illness was punished. If someone missed work due to illness, they not only lost a day of work, but could also be fined. It's as if the factory didn't recognize the worker as human, but merely as an extension of the machine. A broken engine could be fixed, a tired body punished. The logic was simple. Those who couldn't handle it were left. And paradoxically, some supervisors used fines to reinforce their power. All they had to do was invent a mistake or exaggerate a flaw to impose a penalty. Workers thus lived under double pressure from the machine and from the human eye that controlled their wallets. This abuse further eroded dignity, turning wages into a perpetually threatened prize. Thus, the already scarce money became even smaller, and the cycle of poverty never broke. Each fine was a reminder that on the factory scales, the worker was worth less than the production. And, faced with this reality, many parents ended up bringing their own children into the same system, where child labor became common and acceptable practice. In Victorian England, it was common to see small children sharing space with adults in factories. Some were barely old enough to attend school, but they already spent hours pulling wires, cleaning machines, or carrying baskets. The reason was simple and cruel. Small hands were useful for reaching into gears and tight spaces. Plus, they cost much less. It was a cold logic that treated innocence as a cheap tool. Women also occupied a large part of this workforce. Many were widows or mothers who needed to support their families. They received lower wages than men, even though they performed the same work, and were still responsible for taking care of the house at the end of the day. Imagine a mother who, after 14 hours at the factory, still returned to prepare food, wash clothes, and care for the children. The burden was double, both physical and emotional. The presence of children and women was so normalized that few people were shocked. For the factory owners, it was just an economic strategy. For families, it was about survival. Many parents saw child labor not as a choice, but as the only way to avoid hunger. It was as if childhood had been exchanged for shift work, with no right to play, no right to learn. School was reserved for the privileged few. The conditions, of course, were even harsher for them. Children tired quickly, had accidents easily, and were often punished in the same way as adults. There was no age distinction when it came to discipline. It was like making an elementary school student work at the same intensity as a college student, both receiving grades, but without considering the difference in preparation. The injustice was evident, but invisible to the society of the time. This use of vulnerable labor also left a profound social scar. Women were seen as secondary workers, children as disposable resources, and this view perpetuated inequalities that echo in the labor market to this day. It's curious to note how certain structures persist. Even today, in many places, women are paid less, and children continue to be exploited in various sectors. History insists on repeating itself. Thus, the factory's daily routine was filled with tired children's voices and overworked women, all swallowed by the same metallic noise. And amidst this suffocating environment, there was also a silent enemy: constant exposure to dust, heat, and lack of ventilation, which made air conditioning yet another daily challenge. The air inside the factories was a character in itself, heavy, dense, almost palpable. Cotton dust floated everywhere, getting into eyes, sticking to skin, and choking the lungs. Workers spent hours breathing this seemingly harmless white powder, but it gradually filled their lungs like invisible sand. It was like living permanently inside a flour bin. Never. Heat was also part of the routine. Steam engines, combined with the crush of bodies, turned the warehouses into veritable ovens. Ventilation was a non existent luxury: small windows, few openings, and stagnant air. Imagine spending 12 hours in a sauna, but without the comfort of getting out and diving into a pool. There was no refreshment there, just constant sweat and soaked clothes that stuck to your skin. This combination of dust and heat was devastating to health. Chronic cough, breathing problems, extreme fatigue, symptoms that became part of daily life. Many workers, still young, had the labored breath of old people. Today, when we enter a poorly ventilated space, we feel uncomfortable within minutes. Now imagine living like this every day, month, year, without a break. And even faced with this reality, there were no alternatives. Complaining was pointless. Asking for improvements felt like a challenge to authority. So the body learned to resist as best it could. Some used cloths on their faces, improvising rudimentary masks, but it was of little use. The dust passed, the heat remained, and the routine continued. It was like trying to hold back the rain with a punctured umbrella, the illusion of protection without real results. Interestingly, this atmosphere also shaped how people viewed the world outside the factory. The fresh air of the streets, however dirty, seemed like a divine gift. The simple act of breathing without choking was a rare privilege. Today, when we open the window and feel the wind on our faces, we hardly think of it as wealth. But for the Victorian worker, it was almost an unattainable luxury. Thus, dust and heat became an inseparable part of daily life, permeating bodies and clothing, leaving invisible marks on every worker. And amid this suffocating environment, there was yet another danger that could not be ignored: frequent accidents, capable of turning an ordinary day into tragedy in a matter of seconds. The factory was a place where danger always lurked. A second of distraction, and the cotton thread could pull a finger, an entire hand, or even catch the hair of anyone working too close to the gear. The constant noise drowned out even screams, and accidents often went unnoticed until it was too late. It was an environment where risk was not an exception, but part of the routine. Stories of mutilation were common knowledge. Children lost fingers, women had their hair ripped out, men were left with deep scars on their arms. Incredibly, this didn't stop production. The machine continued to run, indifferent to the human body. The injured worker was quickly replaced, as if he were just another discarded defective part. Progress stopped for no one. This scenario caused each worker to develop a kind of silent paranoia. Their movements were always calculated, like someone dancing on a glass floor. Imagine cooking with a sharp knife all day, knowing that at any moment you could seriously cut yourself. Now multiply that risk by 12 hours straight, every day. The fear wasn't fleeting, it was permanent, ingrained in your bones. The curious thing is that over time, many workers even became accustomed to the fear. The scars became almost invisible medals, marks of survival. So and so lost 2 fingers, they would say, as if it were just another detail, a human statistic. It's like when someone says they encountered heavy traffic on the way to work. Common, expected, inevitable. That's how accidents were, trivialized by routine. And then there was the humiliation associated with these tragedies. Instead of receiving support, many were accused of neglect, as if it were solely their fault. It was a double burden, losing part of their body and being blamed for it. Without insurance or proper treatment, many simply disappeared from the factories, replaced by others who would soon face the same risk. Thus, daily life was marked by a bitter coexistence with danger, as if everyone knew that sooner or later something would happen. And if accidents already punished the lives of those who worked, low wages only added to this cycle of suffering, making it nearly impossible to support a family with dignity. Victorian workers' wages were so low, they seemed like a cruel joke. After endless hours, the money they received barely covered the basics: bread, potatoes, and coal to heat the house. It was like running a marathon and receiving a glass of water for the victory. Many workers reached the end of the week already in debt, having to choose between eating or paying the rent. The mathematics of survival never added. Women, even working under the same conditions, earned even less. Children earned pennies, and this amount, though paltry, was essential for the family budget. Imagine relying on the work of an 8-year-old child to put food on the table. It was a painful reversal where childhood was lost to supplement the adult's wages, and yet hunger stalked many homes. Interestingly, factory owners saw low wages not only as exploitation, but also as market justice. They argued that they were paying what was necessary, deliberately ignoring the family's miserable conditions. It's similar to certain modern justifications used by companies that exploit interns or outsourced workers, claiming they're providing an opportunity. These are fancy words to cover up inequality. This financial scarcity shaped extremely limited consumption habits. No luxuries, no leftovers. The diet was limited to the essentials: stale bread, potatoes, porridge. Clothes were mended until they could no longer be repaired. Household objects were passed down from generation to generation, even when broken. It's like living permanently in economy mode, never knowing what leftover meant. For many, abundance was just a distant idea, and when the wages weren't enough, survival strategies emerged. Some took on extra work outside the factory, like carrying coal or selling small goods on the streets. Others went into debt at local markets, paying with future labor. It was a never ending cycle where the worker was always in debt to someone. Working didn't mean prosperity, it just meant postponing misery for a few more days. Thus, the money that was supposed to bring security was in practice a constant reminder of scarcity. Poverty became not just a condition but a destiny, and this destiny was reflected in the places where these families lived. Simple, overcrowded houses, built in working class neighborhoods that grew like a lightless maid. Workers' homes were so small that they barely accommodated the large families who lived in them. Cramped quarters, often shared by 6, 8, or even 10 people, made rest a daily struggle. The air was heavy and humid, and the lack of windows made the environment stifling. Imagine arriving home exhausted and having to share a bed or even the hard floor with siblings, children, or neighbors. Home offered no relief, only a continuation of fatigue. These houses were located in working class neighborhoods built in haste without any planning. Narrow, muddy streets, open sewage ran alongside the makeshift sidewalks. The smell was constant, a mixture of garbage, coal, and disease. For those who complain about traffic or city noise today, just imagine living in a place where even breathing was a risk. It was a life where comfort was a non existent word. The curious thing is that despite the precariousness, there was a sense of community there. Neighbors helped each other, shared food, and took care of each other's children. It was a solidarity forced by necessity. When there's not much, sharing becomes instinctive. It's like when in a flood or a blackout, people come together without a second thought. In working class neighborhoods, this unity was a daily occurrence because the enemy was constant: poverty. The houses were also marked by improvisation. Roofs patched with whatever material was available, crooked doors that didn't close properly, cracked walls. Yet these fragile structures were called home. The contrast is stark when we consider our homes today, even the simplest ones, with running water, electricity, and some comfort. To the Victorian worker, this would have sounded like a luxury fit for royalty. And diseases found fertile ground in these places. Tuberculosis, cholera, influenza, all spread rapidly amid the overcrowding. Children were the most vulnerable, and many families buried their young children, victims of unsanitary conditions. It was like living in an invisible minefield where every cough could be the beginning of a tragedy. Life inside the home was almost as risky as inside the factory. Thus, working class neighborhoods became symbols of inequality, labyrinths of brick and smoke, where rest was never truly felt and dignity seemed perpetually lacking. And amidst this landscape, even people's identities were shaped by what they carried within them. The smell of coal, which permeated clothing and became the worker's trademark. Coal was so present in the worker's life that it seemed to live inside him. The chimney's incessant belching smoke spread particles that stuck to everything: walls, clothes, hair, skin. No shower could handle it. The strong smell of coal became part of the worker's identity, like an invisible uniform. Imagine trying to sleep with that odor lingering in your pillow, reminding you of your work even while you rest. Clothes were a separate chapter, always the same, rarely washed frequently. They were always stained with soot. With each touch, they left a black mark on the fingers, as if betraying the life of the wearer. It wasn't just a matter of hygiene, but of social status. One look at someone was enough to know they were a worker. Coal was a social scar no one could hide. Interestingly, even taste was affected. Many reports describe how coal dust mixed with food, especially when prepared in environments close to smoke. Porridge tasted metallic, bread had traces of. Eating wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about living daily with the taste of the factory. It's like chewing on memories you've just left, never quite freeing yourself from them. And despite everything, people got used to it. Their noses stopped perceiving the odor, but visitors noticed it immediately. It was like when someone enters a house with a strong smell of spices or cigarette smoke. The resident no longer notices it, but those arriving from outside are startled. To the worker, the smell was invisible. To the world, it was a stamp that marked. This impregnation also had a symbolic effect. Coal represented the price of progress. Its soiled clothes impregnated the body and shortened lives. It was impossible to separate personal life from work life because even the smell reminded the worker of his condition. It was as if the factory held the key, not only to his time, but also to his own body. Thus, even the act of breathing and getting dressed became a testament to the daily effort. The smell of coal wouldn't go away, and with it came the memory of an environment where even meal times were marked by precariousness. Makeshift canteens, where a meal was little more than a temporary relief. Mealtime, which in theory should have been a relief, differed little from the rest of the routine. The makeshift cans were dark, stuffy spaces, often nothing more than a corner of the factory itself. There were no lavish tables or hot dishes, just rustic benches, simple bowls, and flavorless food. The workers ate quickly, almost in silence, as if simply fueling a machine to keep it running. The meals were repetitive and not very nutritious. A piece of stale bread, cold potatoes, watery porridge. Sometimes a piece of meat of questionable quality. The body received calories but not enough energy. Imagine facing an entire day of intense physical exertion sustained by a snack that barely feeds a child. It was like trying to fuel a locomotive with twigs. It might run, but it loses power with every kilometer. Interestingly, despite the scarcity, these meal times held symbolic value. They were perhaps the only moments when workers could stop, breathe, and exchange a few words with colleagues. Between a sip of weak tea and a bite of bread, there were quick conversations, discreet jokes, small breaths of humanity. It wasn't a comforting respite, but it was a reminder that there was still life beyond the machine. And working women faced an even more demanding routine. Many brought simple lunches from home, hastily prepared before dawn. The meal they shared at the factory was the result of hours stolen from their own rest. It was as if they worked twice, first at home, preparing, then at the factory, consuming. And even with these efforts, the food was still insufficient for the hardships of the day. Over time, the body took its toll. Poor nutrition, weakened muscles, increased disease, and left workers vulnerable. There were no supplements, no vitamins, just the repetition of a meager diet that kept the flame of life burning at the limit. Today, when we complain about the monotony of eating rice and beans every day, we can hardly imagine what it would be like to live on dry bread and thin porridge, with no alternatives. Thus, even mealtime reflected the poverty of the routine. There was no pleasure, no real rest, just a quick break to prolong the work. And, as if that weren't enough, the monotony was also repeated in the daily menu. Bread, potatoes, and porridge became almost symbols of working class life. The Victorian workers' table was marked by repetition. Bread, potatoes, and porridge made up almost every meal, from breakfast to dinner. There was no variety, no elaborate seasonings. It was the simplicity of survival, cheap carbohydrates that gave you volume but didn't truly nourish you. Imagine opening the refrigerator every day and finding the same three ingredients with no option for substitution. Bread, usually hard and made from inferior flour, was the staple. Water or weak tea to soften, it became the most practical resource. Potatoes, in turn, were boiled or roasted in large quantities, serving to sustain the entire family. Porridge, thin and flavorless, filled the empty space in the stomach, but left a feeling of incompleteness. It was eating without pleasure, merely out of necessity. This limited menu reflected the poverty of wages. Meat, fruits, and vegetables were once luxuries, almost inaccessible. Children grew up without knowing the taste of a nutrient rich meal. Today, when we talk about a balanced diet, we think of protein, vegetables, and fiber. For the worker, the word balance did not exist. Food was minimal fuel for the body to last another day. The curious thing is that even amidst this scarcity, little tricks emerged to vary the flavor. Some families used leftover broth, stored fat, or even simple herbs to add flavor to the porridge. It was creativity transforming little into something bearable. It's like when someone improvises a dish with what's left in the fridge. Only in the case of the worker, this improvisation was the rule, not the exception. This diet also left visible scars: overly thin bodies, pale skin, weakened teeth. Health directly reflected what people ate or didn't eat. Many fell ill early, lacking the energy to endure hard work. Today, we know that nutrition is a pillar of longevity. Back then, it was a forgotten detail, reduced to a minimum to keep the wheel turning. Thus, bread, potatoes, and porridge became more than just food. They were symbols of a restricted, limited, and almost colorless life. And while the meals were meager, the lighting inside the factory itself reflected this scarcity, consisting of candles and oil lamps that barely illuminated the work environment. The factory, besides being noisy and suffocating, was also dark. Lighting came from candles or oil lamps, which barely overcame the coal smoke and cotton dust. Shadows crept into the corners, creating a gloomy, almost claustrophobic atmosphere. Imagine working for hours at a time, trying to see tiny details under dim light that flickered with every draft. It was a strain on the eyes and mind. The use of these improvised lights also posed dangers. The open flames were placed near flammable fabrics and grease-laden machinery. One carelessness, and a fire could spread with alarming speed. Many fires destroyed entire factories, taking with them not only material goods, but also human lives. Today, we rely on safe light bulbs and emergency systems. Back then, every lit candle was also a silent threat. The curious thing is that for the workers, darkness became part of their routine. They learned to work with reduced vision, developing an almost instinctive way to operate machinery without being able to see clearly. It's like when someone learns to walk around their house in the dark, memorizing every step. The difference is that, in their case, any mistake could be costly, not just a stumble on the sofa. This gloom also had a psychological impact. The dark environment reinforced the feeling of oppression, as if the worker were forever trapped in an endless night. The lack of natural light disconnected people from the outside world. There was no sense of morning, afternoon, or dusk, just the same dim, sad glow of the lamps. It was like living forever in a basement, unaware of what was happening beyond the walls. And paradoxically, many workers began to value daylight even more. The simple act of leaving the factory and seeing the sun became a rare gift. Today, when we open the window and complain about the strong sun, we rarely consider what it would be like to live surrounded by darkness. For them, brightness wasn't just comfort, it was freedom. Light symbolized life outside the factory. Thus, the poor lighting made the work even more arduous, reinforcing the idea that the environment was hostile in every sense. And if the week was already marked by so many hardships, only one day stood out as an exception: Sunday, the only real break the worker knew. For the Victorian worker, Sunday was almost sacred, not by choice, but by necessity. After 6 days of noise, heat, and repetition, their bodies begged for a break. It was the only time they could wake up without the factory whistle, feel the silence, and realize that a world still existed beyond the gears. Imagine the feeling of, for one day, not having to run, just breathe. This rest, however, was far from a luxury. Sunday was often dedicated to household chores, washing clothes, repairing objects, preparing food for the following week. The body rested from the factory, but remained active in other obligations. It's like when someone today uses the weekend to take care of errands, pay bills, and organize the house. True rest was rare, almost non existent. The church also occupied an important space that day. For many, it was the only time for community gatherings where they could exchange words, listen to sermons, and feel some sense of belonging. Interestingly, going to church represented more than faith. It represented a mental break, a symbolic escape from the factory. It was like watching a movie or reading a book today, a chance to travel beyond the harsh reality. The children on that day had a breath of freedom. They could run through the streets, play with rocks, and invent simple games. It was a fleeting relief, but enough to remind them that childhood still existed, even if interrupted by weekday work shifts. This contrast between playing on Sunday and returning to the factory on Monday was painful, but it also reinforced the importance of that one free day. And there was something symbolic about this weekly rhythm. Sunday served as a ray of hope, a promise that despite the hardship, there was always a break on the horizon. The worker knew he only had to endure 6 more days to get there. It's like when we count down the days until the weekend. The logic was already present, only with much more intensity. Rest was minimal, but thus, Sunday became the only breathing space in a suffocating life. But precisely because it was so short, it further reinforced the weight of routine. And it was in this contrast between oppression and respite that resistance movements began to emerge, such as Chartism and the first strikes that dared to challenge the factory owners. Amid the forced silence of the factories, a murmur began to emerge that would soon become a collective cry: Chartism. This movement, led by workers who could no longer tolerate injustice, sought basic rights like shorter working hours and more decent wages. It was as if, for the first time, the workers realized that united, they could be stronger than the factory whistle. Fear began to give way to courage. The strikes, initially small, took shape in the dark streets of working class neighborhoods. They were impromptu meetings in taverns, churches, or even backyards, where men and women discussed their pain in hushed tones so as not to attract attention. Imagine dozens of exhausted workers with calloused hands, risking what little they had to fight for something greater. It was a high stake, but dignity was already worth more than reduced wages. Interestingly, Chartism wasn't just about working conditions. It was also a political movement demanding representation in parliament, something unimaginable for the elite of the time. Workers demanding a voice felt like an affront, yet their petitions circulated, signed by thousands of hands, showing that even the most silent could write their own story. It was like a virtual protest today, but done with pen and paper. These movements, of course, were met with resistance. Employers threatened, fired, and hired replacements willing to accept any conditions. The government, in turn, responded with violence. Troops in the streets, arbitrary arrests, and the repression of protests. It was an unequal battle, but one that made it clear that something was changing. The factory was no longer just a place of production, but also a stage for revolt. And despite the initial defeats, each strike planted seeds. Workers learned to organize themselves, to recognize their collective strength, to realize that they were not alone. It was a slow but transformative. Just as a constant dripping water pierces stone, the workers' persistence began to erode the absolute power of the factory owners. The revolution was not in the machines, but in the voices that were raised. Thus, Chartism and the first strikes marked the awakening of a new class consciousness. But while some fought, others still lived under the constant weight of the fear of losing their jobs, a threat so present that it shaped every gesture and every word within the factories. The life of Victorian workers was marked by an inexhaustible fear, the fear of losing their job. All it took was a delay, a machine error, or even illness for someone to be unceremoniously replaced. The line of desperate workers at the factory gates was long, serving as a daily reminder that no one was indispensable. Imagine working with the feeling that your place could be taken at any moment. This fear wasn't abstract. It was real and palpable. Entire families depended on the salary of a single worker, and dismissal meant immediate starvation. There was no insurance, no compensation, no second chances. The factory was generous only in its coldness. It gave work to those who were ready, but dismissed those who failed without a second thought. It's like living in a game where every mistake costs all the curious thing is that this insecurity shaped behavior. Workers avoided questioning rules, bowed their heads in the face of injustice, and endured humiliation in silence. Fear was an invisible shackle, stronger than any iron chain. Today, when we talk about a comfort zone, it almost seems ironic. For the worker, there was no comfort, only a constant race to avoid being forgotten in the queue. Even health was sacrificed in the name of stability. Many went to work sick, feverish, and coughing up blood, because missing work could mean losing their jobs. The logic was cruel. It was better to die inside the factory than to be condemned to starve to death outside it. This terrible dilemma demonstrates how work wasn't just about effort, but also about survival against abandonment. This environment of fear also divided the workers. Instead of always sticking together, many distrusted each other, fearing that someone would report them or try to steal their spot. It was a silent competition fostered by factory owners to maintain control. The more the workers distrusted each other, the less strength they had to resist together. Thus, employment wasn't synonymous with security, but with constant tension. And within this climate of fear, a practice that shocks us today was seen as completely normal: child labor, which not only filled vacancies, but became part of the daily operations of factories. 19th century England, seeing young children working in factories was so commonplace it barely caught anyone's attention. Boys and girls as young as 6 and 7 years old were already spending long hours among machines, carrying weights, cleaning gears, and performing tasks that required agility. This absurdity was treated as normal. For many, childhood wasn't a time for play, but merely the early beginning of a working life. The justifications were always the same. Small hands could reach places, adults couldn't, and children cost much less. Employers saw them not as people, but as cheap, disposable tools. Parents, crushed by poverty, saw child labor as a way to increase the family income. It was a cruel dilemma: protect their children from the factory, or put them there to prevent everyone from going hungry. The curious thing is that society accepted this practice without much questioning. In newspapers, politicians, and even religious leaders saw child labor as a natural extension of working class life. Schooling was relegated to the background, almost a luxury, while a privileged few learned to read and write. Thousands of children grew up with the only education possible: the noise of machines and the discipline of whistles. The consequences were devastating. Small, fragile, and still forming bodies suffered from exhaustion, accidents, and illness. Many didn't reach adulthood or age too early, leaving irreversible physical scars. It's like time being sped up. A 10-year-old child's face bore the expression of a weary adult. Innocence was stolen before it could even blossom. And yet, there was a silent resistance. Some families tried, in some way, to give their children small moments of childhood. A quick game on Sunday, a story told at night, an improvised game with stones in the street. These were glimpses of humanity amidst the harshness. Today, when we see children running free in squares, it's hard to imagine that in another era, this right was denied to almost. Thus, child labor became entrenched as part of the Industrial Revolution, masking suffering under the label of necessity. But over time, the shock generated by this practice would help drive the first labor laws. Still fragile, but beginning to impose limits on this system. The growing pressure on factories and shocking stories of abuse began to echo outside the working class neighborhoods. This is how the first labor laws, known as Factory Acts, these measures sought to impose some limit on working hours, especially for children. On paper, it seemed like a revolution. For the first time, the state admitted that something was wrong with the gears of progress. But in practice, change was slow and almost symbolic. The 1833 law, for example, prohibited very young children from working and reduced the hours of older children. It also mandated some form of inspection, but inspectors were few and easily corrupted. It was like placing a lone guard over an entire stadium. Employers found loopholes, forged documents, and altered age limits. What seemed like protection often turned out to be just another legislative flourish. Still, these laws held enormous symbolic value. They demonstrated that society was beginning to see workers not just as cogs, but as people. It's like a child taking their first steps, unsteady, uncertain, but necessary for walking. For workers, they represented a spark of hope that the future could be different, even if the present remained harsh. Interestingly, the factories themselves adapted creatively to the new rules. Some transferred children to less strenuous but still exploitative tasks. Others simply demanded more from adult women and men, overworking them even further. It was a power struggle in which each legal advance was met with maneuvers to maintain exploitation, like a cat that always finds its way out through the door. These early laws also opened the way for broader social debates. Newspapers began publishing complaints, Writers described the daily lives of workers in books, and public opinion slowly became more aware. The factory, which had previously been a symbol of progress, began to bear the weight of exploitation as well. It was like looking at a shiny coin and realizing how much it could cut when turned over. Thus, the factory acts represented the beginning of a long struggle, fragile at first, but capable of planting seeds that would later blossom into more solid rights. However, factory owners did not accept these changes without resistance and would do everything to delay the social reforms that threatened their profits. When the first laws were introduced, factory owners reacted as if they were being robbed. To them, any limit on exploitation represented a direct threat to profit. They argued that reducing working hours or restricting child labor would destroy the economy, delay progress, and, ironically, harm the workers themselves. It was the same old rhetoric, disguising self interest as collective concern. Resistance was not limited to speeches. Many industrialists manipulated reports, bribed inspectors, and created false documents to prove they were within the law. It was like a rigged game where the rules existed only to be bent. Meanwhile, children continued to work, and adults endured grueling workdays despite promises of change. Interestingly, some factory owners presented themselves as benefactors, offering small improvements to disguise abuses. They built nearby housing for workers, offered elementary schools, or even hosted small community parties. But all this came at a price. To reinforce loyalty and prevent strikes, it was like giving alms in exchange for silence. The structural problem remained untouched. This resistance also had political support. Many parliamentarians had direct ties to the industry and openly defended the interests of the bosses. Economic power was intertwined with legislative power, and changing the law meant facing giants with deep pockets and influence. It was an unequal battle where each breakthrough cost years of fighting. Still, popular pressure grew. Writers, journalists, and even doctors denounced working conditions, bringing to light stories the elite preferred to ignore. With each publication, the image of industrial progress was tarnished by reports of poverty and disease. What had previously been seen as mere employer resistance began to reveal itself as systematic selfishness. The mask was slowly slipping. Thus, resistance from factory owners delayed changes that could have transformed lives sooner. But at the same time, this resistance sparked even more indignation, strengthening the mobilization of workers. And in this scenario of struggle, working women assumed a fundamental role, demonstrating that their voices could also echo within the gears. Women weren't just part of the exploited workforce, they also became protagonists in the fight for change. While they spent long hours at the machines, they also carried the responsibility of the home and children. This burden made them even more aware of the need to demand improvements. They knew firsthand that life couldn't be limited to working and surviving. The female voice began to gain ground, even in a world that tried to silence. Many led protests and actively participated in strikes. Often they were the ones who organized neighbors and colleagues, arranging secret meetings to discuss strategies. Imagine the scene. In simple kitchens or narrow courtyards, exhausted women gathered to plan the future. It was a silent but powerful force, driven by the certainty that no one would defend their rights if they didn't do it themselves. The curious thing is that despite their courage, they faced double prejudice. As workers and as women, society told them their place was only in the home, but the system itself forced them to work in factories. This contradiction generated outrage, and many turned that indignation into collective action. It was like a compressed spring. The more they were pressed, the stronger they reacted. Some went on to become prominent figures, inspiring future generations. Female workers' leaders spoke in public squares, confronting bosses and even police officers. Their words echoed like sparks, igniting the desire for change in entire communities. Today, when we see women leading social movements, it's impossible not to see the roots planted back then. They were the ones who paved the way. Beyond the public struggles, there were also small, everyday acts of resistance. Women refused to accept humiliating conditions, taught their children to read at home, sewed flags for nighttime protests. These seemingly small gestures were huge building blocks of collective consciousness. It's as if each act were a seed planted in hard but fertile soil. Thus, working class women proved that their struggle wasn't just for themselves, but for the entire working class. Their leadership demonstrated that change depended not only on grand speeches, but also on the quiet courage of everyday life. And while they organized, other workers crowded the factory doors in endless lines seeking a job. On the streets of industrial cities, a scene was repeated daily: huge lines of men, women, and even children waiting outside the factory gates. The hope was simple, almost desperate: to get a job. Many arrived in the early hours of the morning, vying for space, as if in a silent auction for their very survival. Work was a rare commodity, and the boss chose carefully, without hate. These lines weren't just annoying, they were humiliating. Hungry, poorly dressed people stood for hours, watching the chosen ones enter while the rest returned empty-handed. Imagine waiting hours for a job interview and in the end being dismissed without a word. Now multiply that feeling by days, weeks, years. The psychological toll was as devastating as the hunger. The curious thing is that these lines became part of the urban landscape. Children played nearby, street vendors took the opportunity cheap bread or weak tea, and neighbors recognized each other there. It was almost an open-air labor market, but without any dignity. For each vacancy offered, dozens jostled for one another as if it were a rare prize. It was survival in the form of competition. This abundance of applicants served as a weapon for employers. All they had to do was look outside and remind workers, if you don't want to, there are 100 waiting to get in. The fear of waiting in line haunted even those already inside, creating an atmosphere of submissiveness. Today, when we feel the pressure of a market saturated with resumes, we can imagine a pale shadow of this reality. But in the 19th century, this shadow was a constant presence. Some even accepted even worse conditions to secure their position: lower wages, longer hours, and riskier tasks. The line itself was a cruel reminder that workers were worth little. It was as if their very existence was traded in pennies. A yes from the boss was a passport to days of exhaustion, but a no could mean immediate starvation. Thus, the factory gates became stages of despair, where every face reflected the struggle for survival. And to make matters worse, not everyone who managed to get in received the same treatment. There were clear differences between skilled workers and those who were merely brute force. Within the factories, not all workers were viewed equally. Skilled workers, those who mastered a specific skill, such as adjusting looms or repairing gears, received slightly better wages and were treated with a certain degree of respect. The unskilled, hired only for repetitive and heavy tasks, were seen as easily replaceable. The division was clear: reinforcing a system of hierarchy within the working class itself. This difference created not only inequality, but also tension. Qualified workers often tried to protect their positions, avoiding sharing knowledge to avoid losing their privilege in the eyes of their bosses. The unskilled, on the other hand, resented the disparity. It was as if, within the same sinking ship, some had access to lifeboats, while others had to swim without any support. Everyone suffered, but to varying degrees. Interestingly, for factory owners, this division was useful. It kept workers fragmented, preventing a full union against injustice. While some believed they had something to lose, others felt too undervalued to fight. It was a subtle but effective strategy for maintaining control. Today, we see echoes of this logic when certain companies create internal divisions to prevent employees from uniting. Despite the difference in treatment, the reality for both converged: exhausting workdays, risk of accidents, and barely subsistence wages. The skilled worker might have more bread on the table, but he still faced the same heavy factory air, the same deafening noise, and the same fear of illness. The privilege was relative, almost illusory, when compared to the general exploitation. This division also shaped identities. Many skilled workers saw themselves as different, almost an elite, within the working class. This generated rivalries, but also, in some cases, bridges. There were those who used their position to give voice to collective struggles. It was precisely some skilled workers who became union leaders, transforming their knowledge into an instrument of resistance. Thus, the difference between skilled and unskilled served both to divide and at crucial moments to unite. But regardless of position, everyone shared the same expanding urban space. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham, which grew rapidly, shaped by the smoke and rhythm of factories. Manchester and Birmingham became living symbols of the Industrial Revolution. The growth of these cities was so rapid, it seemed impossible to keep up. In just a few years, modest villages transformed into crowded urban centers, filled with factories, smokestacks, and working class neighborhoods. The streets bustled with people, carts laden with coal, and the constant sound of hammers and wheels. It was like watching a city being built and suffocated at the same time. This growth, however, was unplanned. Houses sprang up side by side, with no sanitation, no space, no ventilation. The contrast was stark. While the factories displayed their modernity of iron and steam, the neighboring neighborhoods accumulated garbage, mud, and disease. Imagine a luxurious building erected next to an open sewer. This was the everyday landscape for those living in the heart of industrialization. Interestingly, despite the poverty, many saw these cities as places of opportunity. People from various regions migrated to Manchester and Birmingham, believing they would find work there. And indeed they did, but at a very high cost. The promise of prosperity soon turned into a harsh reality: low wages, lines at factory gates, and substandard housing. It was a dream that was always accompanied by a night. This rapid growth also shaped a new urban culture. Entire neighborhoods were occupied solely by workers, creating dense communities bound by the same suffering. Taverns, churches, and markets became meeting places where stories of struggle and survival circulated. It was in these spaces that the first ideas of collective organization germinated, the seeds of the unionism that would later grow. At the same time, the elites proudly displayed the progress of these cities. Foreign visitors were drawn to see the large factories and modern machinery as if they were tourist attractions. The gleam of iron and steam deliberately hid the muddy streets and exhausted bodies. It was a spectacle of selective progress, shown only in the best light. Thus, Manchester and Birmingham became ambiguous symbols. On the one hand, industrial pride, on the other, social misery. And it was precisely in this urban melting pot that working class consciousness grew, resulting in increasingly strong unions and new regulations that would slowly transform the world of work. The workers' struggle didn't produce immediate results, but it planted seeds that germinated over time. Collective effort, strikes, petitions, and even defeats served as learning experiences. Little by little, the idea that workers had rights began to gain traction. It was like pushing against a wall. Each generation pushed a little further until the first cracks appeared. Social transformation was slow but steady. The unions were the most visible result of this journey. Workers began to formally organize, creating groups capable of negotiating with employers and putting pressure on the government. What had previously been mere murmurings in factory corridors became a collective voice, recorded in meetings, statutes, and assemblies. This organization shaped a power that finally challenged industrial logic. The curious thing is that despite being illegal at times, unions continued to grow. It was a survival instinct transformed into a political strategy. Workers risked arrest and persecution just to gather, discuss issues, and dream of improvements. It was like lighting a candle in the darkness, small, fragile, but capable of inspiring everyone around. And little by little, these candles became a light. New regulations also emerged in this process. Working hours began to be reduced, protection for women and children gained more space, and inspections became less symbolic. It was still insufficient, there was still exploitation, but the simple fact that the law existed already represented a gigantic advance. The gears that had previously crushed without opposition were now beginning to be adjusted by social pressures. This process, of course, didn't eliminate inequalities, but it paved the way for a different future. The achievements were small victories, like bricks placed one by one in the construction of a new reality. Today, when we speak of labor rights as something guaranteed, we forget that each clause, each rule, cost sweat, pain, and often blood. What we see as natural was, in fact, a victory achieved through collective effort. Thus, the slow social transformation demonstrated that the strength of workers lay not in each isolated individual, but in the collective that came together. It was this awakening of consciousness that gave rise to the world of work as we know it today. But before we delve into this final reflection, we must make room for an engaging introduction, one that captivates the viewer from the start and makes them want to follow the entire journey. So, after diving into this hard, almost suffocating routine, what do you think would have happened to you if you had lived in that time? Would I have survived the 16 hours of work? Would you dare to join an endless line just to compete for a low-paying job? Or perhaps he would have been one of those who raised his voice and helped change history. It's curious to think that in a way we still carry remnants of that past. Today we work fewer hours and have more rights, but the feeling of exhaustion and of running out of time still lingers. The question remains, what will you do with this awareness? Will you just listen to this story, or will you use this knowledge to change your own routine? I want to challenge you. Look at your life right now. What are the gears holding you back? What habits, fears, or beliefs keep you spinning in circles endlessly? The story of the Victorian worker serves as a warning. When you don't make decisions, someone else does, and maybe it's time to take control of your own machine. Comment below what impacted you most in the story and how you see your routine after hearing all of this. Do you also live as a cog in a larger machine? I'd love to hear your perspective. And of course, if you want to continue learning from stories like this, full of details, reflections, and parallels to our own lives, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be with me on this journey of exploring the past to better understand the present.